On April 9th, 1694, a Scottish man named John Law walked into Bloomsbury Square in London and killed somebody. Not metaphorically. He ran his sword through a man named Edward Bow Wilson in a duel over a woman neither of them would ever get. Wilson bled out on the cobblestones. Law was arrested, convicted of murder at the Old Bailey by a judge so notorious for hangings that contemporaries called him infamously sadistic, and sentenced to death. He somehow negotiated the charge down to manslaughter. Then he escaped from prison before anyone could rearrest him and fled to the continent. 26 years later, he controlled the entire French economy. He spent the next 2 decades as a professional gambler. Not the desperate, losing kind, the precise, mathematical kind. Law understood probability better than almost anyone in Europe in 1694. He'd worked it through from first principles. The odds on any game, the edge in any bet, how to stay in the game long enough for the numbers to land in your favor. He worked the card tables of Rome, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and Venice with the patience of a man who knew time was on his side. He made money, lost money, made it back. He built a reputation across Europe as someone you did not want sitting opposite you with real stakes on the table. And while he played, he was thinking about money, about what it actually was, about why economies grew and why they collapsed under conditions that looked identical. He had a theory. It was a good one. He tried to sell it to Scotland in 1705. Rejected. He approached England. Not interested. He worked through the Italian states and the French court. Nobody bought it. For 20 years, John Law wandered Europe with a great idea and no one to sell it to. Then France ran out of money and someone introduced him to the right duke. When Louis XIV died in September 1715, he left France with roughly 3 billion livres in debt, a number approximately equal to a full year of everything the country produced. Not a fraction of it. The whole thing. Annual revenue ran to about 145 million livres. Running the country cost about 142 million. That left 3 million livres a year against a debt of 3 billion. At that rate, paying it down, principal alone, ignoring interest entirely, would take 1,000 years. France wasn't struggling. France was mathematically impossible. The new king was 5 years old. Real power sat with his regent, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, intelligent, dissolute, and completely out of options. Creditors hadn't been paid. The army hadn't been fully paid. Even Versailles was running on borrowed credibility. Philippe was introduced to John Law and granted him an audience. He had nothing to lose. Law's argument had 2 parts. The first, money is not gold. Gold is just a thing people agreed to treat as valuable. There is nothing sacred about it. What an economy actually runs on is confidence. A piece of paper backed by a credible institution is just as good as a coin, and it has one decisive advantage. You can print more of it when the economy needs a push. This was radical in 1716. Every serious economist in Europe believed money was metal. The whole point of money was that it couldn't be conjured out of nothing. The second idea, what if France converted its crushing, unpayable debt into shares in a company? Instead of the government owing fixed interest it couldn't pay, the creditors would become shareholders in a trading enterprise. One position to generate enormous profits from France's colonial territory in North America. The debt would still exist in a sense, but it would be transformed into something that could rise in value rather than simply sitting there strangling the state with interest payments it would never make. Philippe gave him permission to try. In May 1716, Law opened the Banque Générale in Paris, a private bank issuing paper notes backed by silver, usable for paying taxes. The notes circulated. Commerce picked up. By 1718, Philippe nationalized the bank, renamed it the Banque Royale, and backed its notes with the full credit of the French state. Paper money was now real. The debt problem remained. Law needed the company. He got control of the Compagnie d'Occident, the Company of the West, in 1717. It held France's trading rights to the Mississippi Valley, the vast expanse of territory along the river that France had been claiming for decades and barely settling. He renamed it the Mississippi Company and immediately launched the greatest promotional campaign in history. The Mississippi Valley, Law's materials insisted, was rich with gold, silver, furs, and farmland of extraordinary fertility. He sent recruiters through France and Germany to find settlers. Pamphlets described Louisiana as paradise. Engravings showed indigenous people handing Europeans baskets of silver ore, as if the entire continent were simply waiting to be picked up. Louisiana in reality was swamp, malaria, and a few hundred dying colonists around a new port called New Orleans. Founded in 1718, population several hundred, mortality rate alarming. There was no gold. There was no silver. The furs existed in limited quantities, nowhere near enough to justify what was about to happen to the company's share price. But Law wasn't selling Louisiana. He was selling the idea of it. By 1719, he had absorbed every French overseas trading monopoly into the company: tobacco, the African trade, the mint, the entire tax collection system. In January 1720, Philippe named him Controller General of Finance. John Law now controlled France's currency, France's taxes, and France's largest company, simultaneously. No individual in European history had ever concentrated that much financial power in a single pair of hands. Shares went on sale at 500 livres in early 1719. By December, they traded at 10,000, a 1,900% gain in under a year. Rue Quincampoix was a street in Paris barely wide enough for a single carriage. By mid-1719, it was so packed with investors trying to buy and sell Mississippi shares that the city imposed mandatory closing hours. Otherwise, the crowd never thinned. A hunchbacked man rented out his curved back as a writing surface for investors who needed somewhere to sign their contracts. It's the story every memoir of the period tells. He charged by the signature. Business was brisk enough that he retired on it. The word millionaire was coined in French during this period. The language had never needed it before. Servants quit. Coachmen fired their employers and hired their own drivers. A nobleman's footman who had quietly bought shares with years of saved wages bought his former employer's Paris estate from the creditors after the nobleman sold it to speculate further. The Duc de Saint-Simon, who documented the period in obsessive detail, wrote that Law's carriage could barely move through the city streets. The crowds surrounded it. Law received 150 visitors a day at his Paris residence. Foreign ambassadors requested audiences with him before they requested audiences with the regent. New tailors opened to dress the newly rich. New jewelers opened to sell to them. The price of domestic servants doubled and then doubled again because there were so few willing to remain in service. Paris felt physically like it was vibrating. People camped overnight on Rue Quincampoix to hold their place in the trading queue. Philippe threw parties at Versailles to celebrate France's economic resurgence. France, for the first time in anyone's living memory, felt wealthy. And Law had actually done something brilliant. He had taken 3 billion livres of suffocating national debt and converted most of it into Mississippi shares. Creditors who had been holding government IOUs that lost value every year were now shareholders in the most celebrated company in Europe. The debt still existed in a different form, but instead of requiring fixed interest France couldn't pay, it had been transformed into something contingent on the company's future success. The system needed one thing to work: for Louisiana to eventually produce something. It didn't have to be gold or silver. It just had to be enough. Enough commerce, enough revenue from any source, that shareholders had a reason to keep holding at 10,000 livres instead of selling. The moment enough of them decided the shares were worth less, the whole structure would compress. Quickly. The settlers were dying. The gold was not there. The silver was not there. The company's actual revenue was negligible against what its share price implied. Law knew it. He'd known it for months before most of his investors had any idea. But he genuinely believed Louisiana would eventually catch up, that if he could buy enough time, the territory would become what he'd said it was. He thought he could manage it. He thought he could land the plane. He couldn't find the runway. To keep the shares from falling, Law kept printing money. Every time confidence wobbled, the Banque Royale issued more notes. In 18 months, he more than doubled France's entire money supply. By May 1720, The total paper in circulation was roughly 4 times larger than the gold it was supposedly backed by. Monthly inflation in January 1720 hit 23%, not annually, per month. Food prices climbed 60% in a matter of months. The people who hadn't bought Mississippi shares, which was the overwhelming majority of France, the poor, the farmers, the day laborers, were paying more for bread than they had the previous year. Their purchasing power was being silently extracted and transferred to the shareholders on Rue Quincampoix. They had no shares to compensate them. On May 21, 1720, Law tried to land the plane. He issued a royal decree ordering a gradual 6-month reduction in Mississippi share values. A controlled deflation, he calculated, towards something defensible. He believed slow adjustment would prevent panic. It caused immediate panic. The decree was reversed within days. It didn't matter. Everyone who had been quietly wondering whether any of this was real had their answer. Law himself had just admitted the shares were overvalued. On May 29th, 8 days after the decree, Law was dismissed as Comptroller General, but the panic he'd started did not stop when he did. Through June and into July, the crowds kept coming to the Banque Royale, paper notes in hand, demanding the gold the notes had promised. There wasn't enough gold. There had never been enough gold. That was always the point. To slow the drain, the bank began rationing how much coin it would hand over, a little at a time. So people had to come back day after day, and each day the queues grew longer and more desperate. Soldiers were posted to hold them back. On July 17, 1720, the crowd outside the bank on the Rue Vivienne pressed so hard against itself that 15 people were crushed to death. The bodies were carried through the streets to the courtyard of the Palais Royal and laid out beneath the regent's windows so he could see what his money had done. The Banque Royale was declared bankrupt in October. Shares hit 2,000 livres by September, 1,000 by December. Within 2 years, they were back to 500. Law fled France in December 1720. He left wearing borrowed clothes with diamonds sewn into the lining of his coat, in a borrowed carriage on borrowed horses. There was effectively a warrant out for his arrest if he stayed. 8 months earlier, he had been the most powerful financial figure in Europe. He left France the way he had first left Britain 26 years before, on the run and moving fast. He drifted. Brussels, London briefly. Strange, given the murder warrant still technically unresolved. Back to Venice. He sold off what remained of his assets to live on. He kept writing economic theory until the end. He died in Venice in 1729, in a rented room, nearly alone, with almost nothing. France didn't recover its faith in banks for 70 years. That distrust had consequences that compounded in ways people rarely account for. France stumbled through the rest of the 18th century with a financial system unable to support its ambitions. When the 7 Years' War required the kind of large-scale borrowing that Britain managed with relative ease, because Britain had functioning financial institutions its citizens trusted, France couldn't raise money the same way. Each crisis built on the last. By 1789, the French crown was mathematically insolvent again, for many of the same structural reasons Law had tried to solve in 1716. This time there was no Scottish gambler with a theory. There was a revolution instead. Here is the strange part. Law was right. The Federal Reserve does something very close to what John Law was doing on Rue Quincampoix in 1719. So does the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and every other functioning modern central bank. Paper money backed by institutional confidence rather than gold. Sovereign debt converted into tradable instruments. Money supply expanded or contracted to stimulate or cool an economy. These ideas are not radical anymore. They are the operating system of global finance. Law was 3 centuries too early, and his underlying asset, Louisiana, turned out to be swamp and mosquitoes rather than the goldfield he needed. The confidence ran out before the territory could produce anything real. Every central banker who has run a quantitative easing program since 2008 is, in some philosophical sense, doing what Law attempted. The difference is that modern currencies are backed by something more defensible than the promise of silver ore that didn't exist, and the institutions administering them have had 3 centuries of disasters to learn from, including his. The hunchback of Rue Quincampoix made his money, charged his rates, and retired. Nobody recorded what happened to him after that. That's the most normal thing in this entire story. Subscribe if you want more stories like this.
The richest man in Rome had more money than the entire Roman government. Not some of it, all of it. His personal fortune was roughly equal to a full year of Rome's total tax revenue. He had his own private workforce. He owned more of the physical city of Rome than Rome itself did. He helped fund the careers of the men who would become the most famous figures in all of ancient history. And he threw it all away. Not in a bad investment, not in a financial crash. In a single afternoon, in a desert he had no business being in. Fighting a war he was completely unprepared for a reason that had nothing to do with money. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus, and this is the story of how the wealthiest man in the ancient world let one very human feeling, the need to be taken seriously, eat him alive. Most people who know anything about ancient Rome know Caesar. They know Pompey, maybe Augustus. But before any of those men got anywhere near the top, there was Crassus. He was the money behind the machine, the man who made things possible while everyone else was busy giving speeches and winning battles. He was born around 115 BC into a respectable but not spectacular Roman family. His father had been a consul and a general. Decent status, but not wealthy enough to matter in the way Crassus would eventually matter. Then Rome went through one of its ugliest periods: a civil war, a dictatorship, and a purge. And Crassus saw his opening. Here is how Roman prescriptions worked. When the dictator Sulla took power, he published lists of his enemies. Romans he wanted dead. Anyone on the list could be killed on sight, and the killer received a cash reward. The dead man's property was confiscated by the state and then auctioned off, almost always at a fraction of its real value, to Sulla's allies and associates. Crassus was one of those allies. He bought confiscated property at rock-bottom prices. Land, houses, entire estates, all of it going cheap because the previous owners were either dead or running for their lives. He got so aggressive about it that, at some point, he apparently added names to the prescription lists himself. Men who weren't originally targeted but whose property he wanted. When Sulla found out, he cut Crassus off. But by that point, the damage was done and the money was made. He had his seed capital. And now he needed a system. Here's what most people don't think about when they picture ancient Rome. It was one of the most densely packed cities in the ancient world. At its height, possibly close to 1 million people living within its walls. Those people mostly lived in apartment blocks called insulae. Tall, cheaply built, wooden-frame structures. No running water above the ground floor. Everyone cooked on open flames. Streets were so narrow that neighbors across from each other could reach out their windows and shake hands. And there was no fire department, none, anywhere in the city. When something caught fire in Rome, which it did regularly, because it was almost impossible that it wouldn't, the only thing you could do was grab a bucket, scream for your neighbors, and hope. There was no trained crew, no organized response. You just watched it burn until it stopped, or until it spread to your building too. Crassus built a fire brigade. He bought 500 slaves and trained them as a team. Not just firefighters, but architects and builders, too. Men who could demolish a burning section of a building to stop the fire spreading, and then rebuild it once the fire was out. When a building caught fire in Rome, his men would race to the scene, and then they would stop. They would stand there watching, while Crassus walked over to the panicking property owner and started talking. He would offer to buy the building, right now, for whatever price Crassus decided it was worth, which was almost nothing because it was on fire. The owner had two options: refuse and lose everything, or sell to Crassus at his price and walk away with at least something. Most people sold. Then Crassus's men put the fire out, repaired the building, and added it to his portfolio. Plutarch writes, and this is a direct quote, "In this way the largest part of Rome came into his possession." Beyond real estate, he ran silver mines using slave labor. He was deeply involved in tax farming, collecting taxes on behalf of the Roman state in the provinces and keeping a percentage. He trained slaves in skilled trades, accounting, teaching, medicine, and either sold them or leased them out for ongoing income. Every arm of the ancient economy that could be turned into a money machine, Crassus had a hand in it. By the time his fortune reached its peak, he had grown it from less than 300 talents. That's where Plutarch says he started, to over 7,100 talents. That translates to roughly 229 tons of silver. And in Roman terms, it was roughly equal to the entire annual tax revenue of the Roman state. One man, one personal fortune, equal to a whole government's income for a year. And it was not enough. In Rome, money was power. But money alone did not make you great. What made you great was military glory, a battlefield victory, a triumph. The formal parade through the streets of Rome, a victorious general riding in a chariot while his soldiers marched behind him and the crowds cheered. Julius Caesar was in Gaul, conquering territory nobody had ever conquered before. Pompey had already swept through the eastern Mediterranean, destroyed pirates, reorganized whole kingdoms, and come home to a triumph so grand people still talked about it. Both of them had military reputations. Both of them were names that meant something beyond just being rich. Crassus had money, and Crassus wanted what they had. In 60 BC, the three of them formed what historians call the First Triumvirate. Not an official thing, no ceremony, no law. Just a private arrangement between three of the most powerful men in Rome to support each other and stay out of each other's way. Crassus's money, Caesar's ambition, Pompey's reputation. They carved up the Roman political system between them. For a while it worked. But Crassus kept watching Caesar add to his legend and kept feeling the gap between them. Caesar had legions, Pompey had a legacy. Crassus had a property portfolio and a fire brigade. When he was assigned the province of Syria in 55 BC, he saw his chance. Syria sat right on the border of Parthia, the great empire to the east, stretching from modern Iraq all the way through Iran and beyond, wealthy, powerful, and officially at peace with Rome. Crassus did not care about the peace. He was 60 years old and had never commanded a serious military campaign in his life. He had Pompey and Caesar's careers in his head and a desperate need to join them. He looked east and saw one campaign that could change how history remembered him. He had no idea what was waiting for him. In 53 BC, Crassus crossed the Euphrates with 7 legions, approximately 40,000 soldiers. His son Publius came with him, commanding the cavalry. This was going to be his triumph, his moment. The Parthian king sent a general named Surena to stop him. Surena brought roughly 10,000 men, far outnumbered by the Romans on paper. But those 10,000 men were cavalry, heavy armored horsemen called cataphracts, and light horse archers who could fire accurately at a full gallop. Roman legions were the finest heavy infantry in the world. They had been winning battles for centuries. But they won by closing the distance, getting in tight, working in formation. Every Roman battlefield assumption was built around fighting other infantry. Surena knew this. He chose his ground carefully. Flat, open desert near the town of Car-E, where the Romans had no cover, no elevation, no advantage. And then he let the Parthian horse archers go to work. They circled the Roman formations just outside sword range and poured arrows in. When the Romans charged, the Parthians turned and rode away. No infantry in history could outrun a horse. When the Romans stopped and tried to regroup, the Parthians circled back and started shooting again. The Romans crouched under their shields and waited for the arrows to run out. They didn't. Surena had hundreds of camels carrying nothing but spare arrows. The horse archers could keep going all day. Crassus ordered his son Publius to take the cavalry and break the Parthian line. Publius charged with 1,000 Gallic horsemen, and the Parthians retreated in front of him, and then turned, surrounded his entire force, and destroyed them. And then they came back to the main Roman formation. They held up Publius's head on a spear and displayed it in front of the Roman lines. Ancient sources describe Crassus standing completely still when he saw it, his army falling apart around him, men dying, and Crassus standing there, not moving, not speaking. By the time it was over, 20,000 Romans were dead. Another 10,000 were captured and taken as slaves to the far edges of the Parthian Empire. It stands as one of the worst military disasters in Roman history, against an enemy that was outnumbered 4-1. Surena offered to negotiate, a meeting, a parley, some kind of arrangement for the survivors. Crassus's remaining soldiers more or less forced him to go. They were done. They were desperate. They wanted out of that desert. Crassus walked out to meet the Parthians and was killed there. What happened next depends on the source. Some ancient writers claim the Parthians poured molten gold into his mouth after he died. A final joke about a man who could never get enough. Whether that actually happened or whether it's a story that got attached to him because it was too poetically perfect, not to repeat, nobody knows for certain. What we do know is that his head was cut off and sent to the Parthian king Orodes, who was at that moment watching a performance of a Greek play, Euripides's Bacchae, at his court. The Greek actors reportedly used Crassus's head as a prop in the play. The fortune didn't save him. The fire brigade couldn't put out this fire. The 7,100 talents, the silver mines, the property portfolio, the private army of architects, none of it was there in the sand. There is a postscript to all this that I find almost unbearably ironic. Surena, the general who did all this, who beat a Roman army 4 times his size, who killed the richest man in Rome, was executed by the Parthian king shortly afterwards. Orodes was jealous of the fame Surena's victory had brought him. He had Surena killed. Even winning wasn't safe. Everybody in this story lost something. The thing that gets me about Crassus is that he had already won. By any reasonable measure, by any standard a person could apply in 55 BC, he had won. More money than a government. Political power that most men could never touch. A seat at the table with the 2 most consequential people of his age. He could have stayed home. He could have kept doing what he was brilliant at. Buying, building, financing, accumulating. He probably would have outlived Caesar, outlived Pompey, watched the whole republic crack and crumble around him from a very comfortable position. Instead, he went to prove something to himself. That he wasn't just the money guy. That he could stand next to Caesar and Pompey and be remembered the same way. He is remembered. Just not the way he wanted. The richest man in Rome. The man who literally owned the city. Who had figured out how to turn other people's disasters into his wealth. Died broke in a desert because money wasn't enough. Because he needed something no amount of gold could actually buy. There is something in that worth sitting with for a while. And subscribe if you want to keep following where this goes. Because what happened to Caesar and Pompey after Crassus died is where the story gets really dark.
On August 17, 1661, Louis XIV sat in the most magnificent garden in France, watched fireworks, applauded a play written in his honor, and accepted gifts from a man he had already signed an arrest warrant for. The host's name was Nicolas Fouquet. He had spent 3 years and 16 million livres building this estate. He was about to lose all of it in 19 days. He didn't know that yet. Louis made sure of it. This is the story of how France's most powerful financier built the thing that destroyed him, and why the king who took everything from him immediately hired his entire team to build Versailles. Nicolas Fouquet was born in 1615 into exactly the kind of family that France rewarded. His father held senior government posts, and in 1636, when Nicolas was just 20, his father bought him a government position outright for 150,000 livres. This was standard practice under the Ancien Regime. Posts were not earned. They were purchased. You bought your way in, then used the position to recover the investment. Fouquet was exceptional at this. He came to the attention of Cardinal Mazarin, the man who effectively ran France during Louis XIV's childhood. At 19, Mazarin sent Fouquet on his first significant mission. Go to Lorraine, review the financial accounts of a regional duke, and determine whether he was siphoning money that belonged to France. Fouquet went. He found the discrepancies, a teenager doing forensic accounting for the most powerful man in France, and he did it well. By 1653, at 37, Fouquet was appointed superintendent of finances, the man responsible for managing the entire revenue of the French crown. He was the youngest person ever to hold the position. The royal finances were in catastrophic shape. Decades of war under Richelieu and Mazarin had drained them. Less than half of the taxes collected across France were actually reaching the treasury. The rest was disappearing along the way, siphoned off at every level of the collection chain. Fouquet understood this system completely, not just to fix it, to use it. Here is how he made himself rich. The French crown constantly needed emergency funding beyond what taxation could provide quickly. When it needed cash, it borrowed. Fouquet arranged these loans, often from himself, using his own personal credit. He charged the crown interest. When the crown couldn't repay directly, Fouquet was compensated through access to revenue streams, tax duties, income rights from specific regions, control over specific financial flows. He sat at the center of what went in and what came out. The accounts were deliberately complex, layered across multiple jurisdictions and decades of transactions. The line between Fouquet's private fortune and the royal finances he managed was not just blurred, it was designed to be blurred. This was partly how things worked at the time. Historians note that Mazarin himself had operated similarly, and many of the practices later used against Fouquet had been standard under his predecessor. He used the money strategically. He became the greatest arts patron in France. He supported La Fontaine, who wrote poems in his honor. He supported Molière, whose early career he helped finance. Painters, architects, landscape designers, they all worked under his patronage. He built a network of artists and writers who owed him their livelihood. This was not vanity. Patronage was power. A man who controlled who was celebrated controlled a significant piece of the culture, and then he decided to build a chateau. Construction began in 1658. Fouquet hired 3 men, Louis Laveau as architect, André Lenotre to design the gardens, Charles Lebrun to handle the interior painting and decoration. To create the grounds he needed, he purchased 3 villages and demolished them entirely. The people displaced were put to work maintaining what was built on top of where they had lived. At peak construction, 18,000 workers were employed on the site. The total cost came to 16 million livres. To understand what that number meant, in 1661, the annual revenue of the entire French crown was roughly 20 to 25 million livres. Fouquet spent the equivalent of most of a year of France's national income on his private residence. Vaux-le-Vicomte was not merely larger than any royal palace in France. It was better, more coherent, more deliberately conceived. The gardens stretched over a kilometer in geometric precision. The interior ceilings were painted with scenes drawn from Fouquet's own mythology, his symbols, his emblems, his place in the world. His personal crest featured a squirrel climbing. His motto, in Latin, Quo non ascende, to what heights will he not climb? August 17, 1661, 6,000 guests. The chef Vatel prepared the food. Jean-Baptiste Lully composed and conducted the music. Molière premiered Les Fachos, the first comedy ballet ever written, created in just a few weeks specifically for this occasion. The gardens were lit with candles and torches. The fountains ran. After dinner, fireworks burst over the formal gardens while the king and his court watched from the terrace. Every woman at the party received a diamond brooch. Every man received a thoroughbred horse. Louis XIV walked through Fouquet's rooms. He saw the tapestries, the gilded woodwork, the painted ceilings. He saw a home that surpassed every palace he owned. He stood in the gardens and looked at the symmetry, the fountains, the scale. He ate food prepared by France's finest chef, watched a play written in his honor, and received a fireworks display from the man who had funded it all, using money that was, at minimum partly, originally the crown's. Louis did not let any of this show. He smiled. He applauded. He accepted. He had already signed the arrest order. He just hadn't told Fouquet. What none of the 6,000 guests knew that evening was that the arrest had originally been planned for that very night. Louis's advisors had talked him out of it at the last moment. Arresting a man at his own party in front of 6,000 witnesses would look impulsive. It would look like jealousy from a king who couldn't stand to be outdone. Better to wait. Let Fouquet believe the evening had been a success. Let him wake up the next morning thinking the king had enjoyed himself. And that patience, that performance over 19 days, is what makes what came next so deliberate. Because Louis didn't just want Fouquet removed, he wanted him to disappear in a way that made clear what happened to men who outshone their king. The party had to be the last good memory. Everything after it had to be the lesson. On September 5th, 1661, Nicolas Fouquet was arrested in the city of Nantes. Louis had chosen Nantes carefully, far from Paris, far from Fouquet's network of allies and clients and people who owed him favors. The man sent to make the arrest was Captain d'Artagnan, Charles de Batz-Castelmore, the real Gascon musketeer whose life would later inspire Alexander Dumas' fictional hero. He was lieutenant of the King's Musketeers. He took Fouquet in the street quietly without incident, less than 3 weeks from the greatest party in France to a prison escort. The trial ran for nearly 3 years, from 1662 to 1664. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Fouquet's longtime rival, the man positioned to replace him as France's chief financial minister, personally oversaw the composition of the tribunal. He selected judges who were hostile to Fouquet. He had evidence manufactured against him. He had other documents destroyed, specifically records that would have shown Cardinal Mazarin authorizing the very same financial practices Fouquet was now charged for. He denied Fouquet access to legal counsel, and despite all of this, Fouquet defended himself so well that the judges voted to acquit him on most charges. The majority verdict was banishment, exile, leave France. Not imprisonment, not execution, leave. 13 judges voted for banishment, 9 voted for death. Banishment won. Louis XIV rejected the verdict. He commuted the sentence of banishment to life imprisonment. The king was not bound by the courts. He had simply decided that a man found guilty of something by judges who voted to send him abroad would instead spend the rest of his life in a cell. The fortress of Pignerol sits in what is now northwestern Italy, in the Piedmont Alps. In 1665, it was a French military stronghold, chosen specifically for its remoteness. The journey from Paris took weeks. Fouquet was placed in solitary confinement. He remained there for 19 years. He was eventually permitted limited correspondence with family. He read, he wrote, he petitioned. The petitions produced nothing. By the late 1670s, there were discussions about clemency. Fouquet was in his mid-60s in poor health, and had by any reasonable measure been punished far beyond what any court had actually sentenced him to. Nicolas Fouquet died at Pignerol on March 23, 1680. 19 years after D'Artagnan walked him away from the finest evening France had produced in a generation. Louis XIV never visited Pignerol. He was building Versailles. The 3 men who built Vaux-le-Vicomte, Le Vaux, Le Notre, Le Brun were hired by Louis XIV immediately following Fouquet's arrest to design a new royal palace at Versailles. The same architect, the same garden designer, the same painter. The visual language of Versailles is the visual language of Vaux-le-Vicomte, scaled up with royal money and royal ambition. The gardens that became the symbol of French absolute monarchy were conceived by the man who had designed Fouquet's gardens. Every element of Versailles began in a conversation funded by Nicolas Fouquet. Fouquet was not innocent. He had made a fortune through his control of the royal finances in ways that benefited himself at the crown's direct expense. He was guilty of something real, but so was Mazarin, so was Colbert, so was virtually every financial minister in France before him. The specific practices that put Fouquet in a cell for 19 years had been common for decades, often signed off by the very men who later prosecuted him for them. What actually destroyed Nicolas Fouquet was not the embezzlement. It was the chateau, the party, the 6,000 guests, the diamond brooches and the thoroughbred horses, the fireworks over the gardens that were more beautiful than anything the king owned. It was the squirrel on the ceiling climbing and the Latin underneath it. Quo non ascende? Louis XIV had the same question. To what heights may I not climb? And his answer was, not past me, not in my country, not while I'm watching. The man who asked how high he could climb spent the last 19 years of his life in a stone cell in the Italian Alps. The king who smiled through his fireworks used his architect, his gardener, and his painter to build the monument that would make sure no subject ever posed that question again. Vaux-le-Vicomte still stands. Fouquet's descendants still own it. Versailles is the one people come to see. Subscribe for more.
In April 1925, five of the biggest scrap metal dealers in France opened the same letter. Government letterhead, Ministère des Postes et Télégraphes. A meeting, discreet, at the Hôtel du Crillon on the Place de la Concorde. State business. Please do not discuss this with anyone. The man who signed it had the stationery printed the week before. His name was Victor Lustig. Probably. We'll come back to that. And what he was about to sell those five men was the Eiffel Tower. 7,300 tons of iron standing on the Champ du Mars, owned by the city of Paris. Theft never entered into it. Over about 3 weeks, he built something cheaper and far more useful than a crime. The appearance of a legitimate government contract. The letterhead, the suite, the manners, the little apologies for the secrecy. One of those five men wrote him a check and went home and never told anybody. Not the police, not the newspapers. Not for the rest of his life. Getting the check was the straightforward half. Getting the silence took the rest of the operation. Start with why anyone believed it. Because in 1925, the Eiffel Tower was not an absurd thing to sell. Gustave Eiffel had died 2 years earlier, in 1923. His tower was 36 years old, and it was, in the most literal engineering sense, a problem. The structure is puddle iron, iron rusts. To stop it rusting, you repaint the whole thing every 7 years or so, and one coat takes about 60 tons of paint, applied by men hanging off it on ropes in the wind. Paris newspapers ran pieces about what the upkeep was costing and whether the city should keep paying for it. Lustig read one of them in a hotel room. There was real history behind those articles. The tower was built to be temporary. Eiffel got a 20-year permit for the 1889 World's Fair, and on the 1st of January 1910, the whole thing was scheduled to come down. It stayed up for one reason. The French army had strung a radio aerial from the top and found it could reach forts 400 kilometers east. Then, by 1908, 6,000 kilometers. So the state extended the concession by 70 years, and Paris kept its landmark as a side effect of keeping its telegraph masts. Now look at the letterhead again. Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. Lustig didn't pick that ministry because it sounded impressive. He picked the one department in the French state that a scrap dealer would believe genuinely had authority over that tower. Because for 15 years, the tower had been a telegraph installation with a viewing platform attached. The truth had already gone soft in that exact spot. Lustig walked into the gap and stood there like he'd been assigned to it. The meeting was in a salon at the Crillon, one of the 4 or 5 best addresses in Paris, an 18th century palace on the Concorde, the kind of room that does most of your talking before you open your mouth. Lustig had taken a suite. He arrived by chauffeured car, and the first thing he did was apologize for the location. Government business, this sensitive, couldn't be handled in a ministry building, he explained, not with journalists sitting in the corridors. Then he told them the tower was coming down. Engineering faults, repair bills the city could no longer justify. Political complications he was not at liberty to describe. The government had decided to dismantle it and sell the iron, and the decision would not be made public until a contract had been signed, because Paris would lose its mind. Sealed bids, fast decision, total discretion. Then he took them to see it, a hired limousine across the river, and 5 men in good coats standing at the foot of 300 meters of rusting iron, doing arithmetic in their heads about rivets and rolling stock, and where on earth you would even put it. Nobody in that car asked to see a decree. You don't ask a senior civil servant for his paperwork. Asking is the thing that marks you as a man who doesn't belong in the room, and every one of them badly wanted to belong in that room. There's a list that circulates under Lustig's name. 10 rules for con men. Rule 1, be a patient listener. It's this, not fast talking, that gets a con man his coups. Rule 3, wait for the other man to reveal his politics, then agree with them. Rule 8, never boast, just let your importance be quietly obvious. Read it as a business manual instead of a curiosity, and the whole list describes a single activity, and that activity is listening until the other man tells you what he actually wants. In that salon, Lustig was listening for one man in particular, and it wasn't the richest one. He wanted the dealer who was after something the iron could never give him. He found André Poisson. Poisson was provincial. He had arrived in Paris with money and without standing, into a business world that ran on which school you attended and which family you married into and which rooms you'd been invited to since you were 20. He was the man at the edge of the group laughing half a beat late. His wife thought the whole arrangement smelled wrong and said so out loud. Poisson wanted it to be true more than he wanted it checked, because look at what was actually on the table for him. A government contract. The kind of thing that permanently ends the question of whether you are a serious man in this city. The dealer who takes down the Eiffel Tower is never the newcomer again. The iron was the smallest thing Poisson thought he was buying. And then Lustig made the move that separates a swindler from a professional, a move so backwards that once you see it, you understand exactly why no police report was ever filed. He asked Poisson for a bribe. He raised it as a confession. In a private meeting, he went quiet, got visibly uncomfortable, and admitted that a deputy director general at the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs is paid very badly for the responsibility he carries. Other men in his position had found ways to supplement. If Poisson could see his way to adding something on top, for him, personally, discreetly, the contract was Poisson's. Consider what that request proves. An honest official has nothing to sell you. A thief wants your money fast and clean and wants to be gone by morning. A man who asks for a kickback is telling you he holds real power and is willing to abuse it. And he is handing you permanent leverage over him, which no stranger would ever do unless the deal underneath were genuine. The demand for a bribe was the strongest credential in the entire operation. It cost Lustig nothing to produce, and it did more work than the letterhead, the suite, and the limousine combined. It also carried a second set of teeth. The moment Poisson handed over that extra money, he stopped being a buyer. He became a man who had bribed a government official. Poisson paid. How much, nobody can tell you. The figure quoted most often is 1.2 million francs. At 1925's rate of about 21 francs to the dollar, roughly $57,000, call it $1 million today, plus 70,000 francs on the side. Other accounts render the whole thing as $70,000 flat. The official history published by the Eiffel Tower's own operators says only that Poisson bought the tower's iron for an unknown sum. They conflict because there is no receipt, no charge sheet, no complaint, no case file, no court. The number is missing from history because the man who paid it made certain it never entered a record anywhere. Lustig and his partner were on a train out of France within hours. From Vienna, he bought the Paris papers every morning and went looking for his own face in them. Nothing came. Not that week, not that month, not ever. Run through Poisson's options on the morning he understood. He can walk into the préfecture. He can hand over a forged contract, describe a man whose real name he doesn't know, and explain that the money left the country days ago. Odds of recovery, essentially nil. And to file the complaint at all, he has to say the second part out loud, that he also paid a bribe to a public official in order to win the contract. He would say it to a police clerk, then to a lawyer, then it reaches the papers, and then every dealer in the trade, and then it goes home to his wife, who told him. The financial arithmetic says report it. The money's already gone. There's nothing left to lose. The social arithmetic says the money was the cheaper of the two losses, and it isn't close. There's no luck in any of this. Lustig chose a man whose deepest fear was looking like a fool in front of Paris, then arranged matters so that going to the police became the most reliable available way to become one. Shame isn't a side effect of this con, it's the collateral. Now, the part almost every version of this story gets wrong. You've heard that he sold the Eiffel Tower twice. It's in the headline of nearly every article ever written about him, the Smithsonian's included. He tried twice. About a month later, he was back in Paris, back at the Crillon, with fresh letters and a fresh set of names out of the scrap trade. Same suite, same tour, same confidential decree that unfortunately could not be shown to anybody. Somebody in the second group made a phone call. Which call exactly depends on the account you read. The ministry, the city, the police. But the outcome doesn't vary across any of them. The police were told, and Lustig went out of France and onto a boat for the United States without collecting a franc. one sale, one near miss, which is stranger than the legend because it means the con had a shelf life of roughly 4 weeks. It worked for exactly as long as one embarrassed man's silence held, and not a day longer. Underneath all of it sits a harder problem, and it deserves saying plainly. Almost everything you've just heard, the salon, the 5 dealers, the limousine, the bribe, Poisson himself, traces back to a single book, The Man Who Sold the Eiffel Tower, published in 1961 by James Johnson, a retired U.S. Secret Service agent who had worked the counterfeiting case that finally caught Lustig. 36 years after Paris, 14 years after Lustig was dead, there's no French police file, no trial transcript, no complaint from any dealer. By design, the entire function of the shame was to guarantee that none of those documents would ever exist. The best evidence the con happened is the exact shape of the hole where the evidence should be. Then there's the victim's name. In French, poisson means fish. The mark in the most famous confidence trick of the 20th century is called Mr. Fish. What is documented is what Lustig did afterwards, and it doesn't read like the resume of a man who needed a myth invented for him. He sold the Romanian money box, a cedar case fitted with brass dials and rollers that supposedly copied banknotes using radium. $10,000 a unit, and often a great deal more, mostly to wealthy passengers on transatlantic liners who received a 6-hour waiting period and a piece of furniture. A Texas sheriff bought one, worked out the problem, and tracked Lustig all the way to Chicago. Lustig convinced him he'd simply been operating it wrong. He apologized for the confusion and handed him a thick stack of cash as compensation. The cash was counterfeit. The sheriff was arrested passing it in New Orleans. In the early 1930s, he went to Al Capone and asked for $50,000 to fund a scheme, promising to double it in 60 days. He put the money in a safe deposit box and did absolutely nothing with it. 2 months later, he came back, apologized for the failure of the venture, and returned all $50,000. Capone, who lived in a world where money did not come back, was so struck by the honesty that he counted out $5,000 and told Lustig to take care of himself. The $50,000 was the bait. The $5,000 was the whole con. Then he built the operation that finished him. From 1930, working with a chemist named Tom Shaw and a druggist named William Watts, Lustig ran counterfeit hundreds at something like 100,000 fake dollars a month for 5 years. The notes cleared bank tellers. The Secret Service had a name for the problem long before it had a name for the man. They took him on Broadway in May 1935. In his pocket was a key to a locker in the Times Square subway station holding $51,000 in fakes and the printing plates. The day before his trial, he tore his bed sheets into a rope, went out a third-floor window of the Federal Detention Headquarters in Lower Manhattan, a building the government advertised as escape-proof, and climbed down the front of it in daylight, pausing to wipe the windows on his way past. A man cleaning windows is a man nobody looks at twice. Pedestrians watched him do it. Not one of them called anybody. He was free for 27 days. Pittsburgh police picked him up. 20 years, Alcatraz. He spent them complaining. Prisoner 300 filed over 1,000 medical requests. On the 9th of March 1947, he caught pneumonia in the Federal Medical Center at Springfield, Missouri, and 2 days later, he was dead. In 2015, a historian named Thomas Indiel went looking for him in Hostiny, the bohemian town Lustig always gave as his birthplace. Indiel went through everything that had survived: electoral rolls, parish books, records pulled back out of Nazi bonfires, the register of every child who attended the local primary school. Every child in that town is on that list. Victor Lustig is not. There is no record anywhere that he was ever born. There is a record of his death. A clerk in Springfield, Missouri filled out the certificate and reached the line marked occupation. He wrote, apprentice salesman. In 1519, the throne of the Holy Roman Empire went to the highest bidder. Not officially. Officially, 7 German princes met and voted their conscience. But everyone in Europe knew the real rule. The crown went to whoever could pay the electors the most. And the 2 men bidding were the 2 most powerful kings alive, Charles of Spain and Francis of France. Both had armies. Both had kingdoms. Both had gold. Neither of them had enough. The man who actually decided it wasn't a king, he wasn't running, he never sat on a throne in his life. He was a banker in a wool town in southern Germany, and when the bidding was over, he sent the winner a letter that is one of the most astonishing documents in the history of money. We'll get to what it said. His name was Jakob Fugger, and by most honest measures, he was the richest human being who has ever lived. Here's the number people argue about. A journalist named Greg Steinmetz sat down and tried to size Fugger's fortune against the whole economy around him. His estimate, at his peak, Fugger was worth close to 2% of everything Europe produced in a year, 2% of a continent. Run that through to today and you land somewhere near $400 billion. Now, is that exactly right? No, nobody can weigh a medieval economy on a scale. But that's kind of the point. When your best guess puts one man at 2% of a continent, you've stopped measuring a rich person. You've started measuring a force of nature. And he built it from wool. His grandfather was a weaver who walked into Augsburg in 1367 with nothing. 3 generations later, his grandson was choosing emperors. This is the story of how money climbed higher than money had ever climbed before, and what it stepped on getting there. Start with the thing that made all of it possible: metal. In the mountains of Tyrol and the hills of Hungary sat some of the richest copper and silver mines in the world. Digging metal out of a mountain is expensive and slow. You need money up front, and you need it in enormous amounts, years before a single coin comes out. The princes who owned those mountains never had cash. They had titles and debts, so they came to the man in Augsburg who did have cash. Fugger's move was simple and merciless. He didn't just lend the prince money, he lent the money and took the mine's output as collateral. Every load of silver, every ton of copper, signed over to Fugger until the loan was paid. And the loan was never quite paid. So the metal kept flowing to him, year after year. He didn't own the mountains, he owned everything that came out of them. By the 1510s, he had a grip on Central European copper so tight that he could set the price of it across the continent. A man in Augsburg, deciding what metal cost in Antwerp, in Venice, in Rome. His best customer was a family that would matter enormously: the Habsburgs. The Emperor Maximilian was chronically, spectacularly broke, royal, glamorous, and always out of money. He wanted to march on Rome to be crowned by the Pope, and that took cash. He wanted to make war on Venice, and that took cash too. There was exactly one man in the empire who could produce that kind of money in an afternoon. So Maximilian borrowed from Fugger, over and over, because every loan bought Fugger something better than interest. It bought him leverage over the most important dynasty in Europe. The deeper the emperor sank into debt, the more the emperor belonged to him. He was building a trap, one loan at a time. And the Habsburgs walked into it a little further with every war they couldn't afford. What Fugger understood before almost anyone: a king who owes you money isn't your debtor. He's your employee. Then came the deal that lit a fire he never meant to light. In 1513, a young German nobleman named Albert of Brandenburg wanted to become Archbishop of Mainz. It was the top church job in Germany, and getting it meant paying Rome an enormous fee for the privilege. Albert didn't have the money. Fugger did. He loaned Albert 20,000 guilders to buy the office. Now Albert owed a crushing debt to a banker, so he and the Pope worked out a way to pay it back. They would sell indulgences, slips of paper that promised to cut your time in purgatory, and your dead relatives' time too. Half the money raised would go to Rome to build the new St. Peter's Basilica, and half would go quietly to Augsburg to pay off Albert's loan to Fugger. Here is the detail that tells you everything about how this actually ran. The star salesman was a friar named Johann Tetzel, who went from town to town with a chest and a terrifying pitch. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. And walking beside Tetzel at all times, holding the key to that chest, was an employee of the Fugger Bank. Peasants dropped their coins in to save their dead mothers. A banker's clerk held the key. When the chest was full, he counted it, and the money split, half toward a basilica in Rome, half toward a loan in Augsburg. A monk in Wittenberg watched this operation roll through Germany and got angry enough to write it down. 95 complaints nailed to a church door in 1517. His name was Martin Luther, and the thing he set on fire, the Reformation, split Christianity in two and killed people across Europe for the next century and a half. The spark for the largest religious rupture in Western history was, underneath the theology, a debt collection scheme. A banker made a loan. To pay it back, the church sold forgiveness by the coin. And the man who lent the 20,000 guilders just kept collecting his half. And here's the thing to hold on to. The indulgence money was the small business, because 2 years after Tetzel started ringing his coins, the biggest prize in Europe came up for sale, the crown of the whole empire, and Fugger was about to spend more on a single deal than most kingdoms saw in a decade. What he did in 1519 makes the indulgence racket look like pocket change. The old Emperor Maximilian died in early 1519. The throne of the Holy Roman Empire didn't pass to a son. It was elected by 7 men, 3 archbishops, 4 princes. Whoever got the majority of those 7 votes wore the crown of Charlemagne. 2 candidates went for it: Charles, the young king of Spain, Maximilian's grandson, and Francis I, the king of France, who wanted it just as badly and was just as willing to buy it. Everyone understood the transaction. The electors expected to be paid, not bribed in the shadows, paid more or less openly in gold delivered before the vote. The only question was, who could put more on the table? Francis of France emptied his treasury trying. Charles didn't have the cash either. What Charles had was a line of credit in Augsburg. The final bill for the crown came to around 850,000 guilders. To feel that number, a skilled craftsman in that world might earn a few dozen guilders in a year. This was the lifetime wages of tens of thousands of men, handed to 7 people, to make one of them raise his hand for Charles. And of that 850,000, well over half, roughly 543,000 guilders, came straight out of Jacob Fugger's own accounts. The rest he raised and moved through his network. The French king's gold couldn't compete, and not only on size. The electors trusted Fugger's paper more than they trusted a foreign king's promises. Francis could pledge a fortune. But when a banker in Augsburg guaranteed the money, everyone knew the money was already real. On the 28th of June, 1519, the 7 electors chose Charles, unanimously. He became Charles V, ruler of an empire on which the sun famously never set. He ruled half the world. But he'd bought the throne on credit, and the bank always comes to collect. 4 years later, Charles was the most powerful man on the planet, and the German parliament was debating whether to break up the great trading companies, whether to make what Fugger did illegal, cap the monopolies, limit the fortunes. So Fugger picked up a pen and wrote to the emperor. Not a request, a reminder. He told Charles in writing that it was well known His Imperial Majesty could not have gained the Roman crown without his help, and that he could prove it with documents signed by Charles's own agents. Then he asked to be paid what he was owed without further delay. Read that again. A merchant, the grandson of a weaver, telling the elected emperor of half of Europe, "You owe your throne to me, I can prove it in writing, and I'd like my money now." Here's the part that should stop you. Fugger had no army, no fortress, no title anyone had to obey. So how does a private citizen force the most powerful man alive to pay up? He doesn't send soldiers, he controls the tap. Charles's whole empire ran on borrowed money. Soldiers, ships, wars, all of it financed. The day Fugger stopped lending was the day that machine seized. Charles could conquer nations. He could not survive losing his banker. So the most powerful man in the world read the letter and paid. That is the highest point money has ever reached in the story we can document. Not a rich man buying a mansion, a private citizen holding the personal IOU of an emperor and calling it in. So what does a man like that do with all of it? Here's where he gets strange and human. In 1521, in his own city of Augsburg, Fugger built a walled village for the poor. Rows of small, neat houses for craftsmen and laborers who'd fallen on hard times. He called it the Fuggerei. It still stands. People still live in it today. The rent, when he said it, was 1 Rhenish guilder a year. He wrote the terms so they could never change. So today, 500 years later, the rent is still 1 guilder. which now converts to about 88 cents a year, under €1, to live in the oldest social housing project on Earth. There was one more condition, and it's the one that gives the whole man away. Every resident, every day, still has to say 3 prayers for the soul of Jakob Fugger. Sit with that. The man who lent the money that launched the indulgence trade, the trade that told peasants they could buy their way out of purgatory with coins, built himself a machine to generate free prayers forever. He didn't trust the indulgences he'd profited from, so he bought his salvation the old-fashioned way, in perpetuity, from the poor at 88 cents a head. He'd spent his whole life being second to none at making money. At the end, he wanted to be second to none at getting into heaven too. He died on the 30th of December, 1525, at 66. He died about as alone as a rich man can. No children. He never had any. His wife, Zebil U, was 22 years younger, and by the end she'd taken a lover. 7 weeks after Jacob was in the ground, she married that lover, converted to the Protestant faith, the very movement his own bank had helped ignite, and walked away from the Fugger name entirely. The richest man who ever lived spent his last hours with paid clerks and account books. But he'd already written his own goodbye. Before he died, Fugger composed his own epitaph, and it holds no humility at all. He called himself second to none in the acquisition of extraordinary wealth, in generosity, in purity of life, and in greatness of soul. A man who, comparable to none in life, would not be counted among the mortal in death. He wrote that about himself, and the maddening thing is, he wasn't entirely wrong. That's the whole story of Jakob Fugger in one line. Money climbing higher than it had ever climbed, and telling you exactly who it climbed with. A weaver's grandson lent hard money to broke princes, took their mountains as collateral, funded the debt scheme that cracked the church in two, and then spent the wages of tens of thousands of men to hand one king the oldest crown in Europe, and made that king admit, in writing, that he owed him the throne. No sword, no army, a ledger, patience, and the willingness to own a man's debts until the man belonged to him. The textbooks call the 1500s the age of kings and popes and reformers. Fair enough, but every one of them, at some point, had to walk into a small office in Augsburg, sit across from a man in a gold cap, and ask him for the money. That's who really ran it. If you want the next story of money buying a throne, subscribe, because the graveyard of finance is full of men who thought they'd cornered a mountain. Here's a business plan nobody's tried in 2,000 years. You open a burger stand in ancient Rome. Not a metaphor. The Romans had a burger, a real one, minced meat, shaped by hand, cooked on a hot counter and sold to a man on his way somewhere. And they had the storefront to sell it from. The only question left is the one that matters. Do you get rich or do you go broke by the end of the month? Let's find out. You, personally, you're the operator. And I'm going to hand you the real numbers. The ones the Roman state carved into stone, and let you watch your own margins live or die. One honest warning before you sign a lease. Your shop is a stitch-up of 3 different Romes. The counters come from Pompeii, buried by a volcano in 79 AD. The recipe comes from a cookbook tied to Apicius, a first-century gourmet, though the version we can read was probably written down centuries later. And the prices come from one document, Diocletian's price list of the year 301. So this is a composite Rome, and every time a number jumps across that gap, I'll tell you. The dish is called Isicia aumentata. Isicia aumentata. The recipe survives in Apicius. You take minced meat, beef works, pork's cheaper, so pork. You pound it together with white breadcrumbs soaked in wine. You work in pepper and a splash of garum, the fermented fish sauce that went on everything. You tuck a few pine nuts into the middle. Then you wrap the whole thing in caul fat, the thin lacy membrane from around a pig's guts, and you cook it. That caul fat isn't garnish, it's engineering. Lean minced meat cooks dry and sad. The caul melts as it heats and bastes the patty from the outside in. It's the Roman answer to the problem every burger cook still fights. A patty of pounded meat held together with soaked bread, seasoned and fatted and cooked on a hot surface. Call it what it is, it's a burger, so you can make one. The harder question is who buys it, and whether Rome even lets you make money doing this. Start with the fact that makes the whole business possible. Most Romans couldn't cook. Not couldn't, weren't allowed to, really. The poor and the working middle lived in insulae, apartment blocks stacked 5 and 6 floors high. Wood floors, no chimneys, no running water above the ground level. An open cooking fire in a timber building full of sleeping families was how you burned down a city block, and everyone knew it. So most apartments had no kitchen at all, which means dinner came from the street. If you were poor in Rome, you didn't own a stove. You rented your meals, hot, from a counter like the one you're about to open. It wasn't a treat, it was infrastructure, and the archaeology backs it up hard. In Pompeii, one mid-sized town, not even the capital, archaeologists have counted the remains of around 150 of these counters. They're called thermopolia, a stone bench facing the street, big clay jars called dolia, sunk into the top to hold the day's food, a fire to keep it warm. One of them came out of the ground almost whole in 2020. Painted front, a rooster, a dog on a leash, a sea nymph. And inside the jars, the actual leftovers, duck, pig, goat, fish, snails, a real menu, frozen mid-service by a volcano. So the demand is real and the format is proven, a hungry city with no kitchens. That's your market. Now let's see what it costs you to feed them, because this is where the confidence starts to wobble. Every number from here runs in one currency, the denarius communis, the accounting money of Diocletian's price list, 301 AD. And I'm going to give you one ruler to measure all of it. A laborer, an unskilled man hired for the day, fed by his boss, was worth 25 denarii a day under that same law. A skilled man, a mason or a carpenter, 50. So hold that in your head. A day of a man's sweat is 25 denarii. That's the coin we're counting in. Now go shopping. The edict fixed the ceiling on everything you need. Pork, 12 denarii for a Roman pound, about a third of a kilo. Beef would have run you 8, cheaper, but pork's fattier and it holds together, so pork. Your patty takes maybe a third of a pound of meat. Call it 4 denarii of pork in every burger. The bread and wine for the binder, scraps and a splash. Round it to a denarius. The garum, a spoonful. The good stuff was 16 denarii for half a liter, the second grade 12, and you're using a spoon, so under a denarius. Fine. Then you reach for the pepper, and the floor drops out. Pepper in the edict was 800 denarii for a single Roman pound. Do that math against the meat. Your pork costs about 37 denarii a kilo. Pepper costs roughly 2,400 a kilo. Gram for gram, the pepper is more than 60 times the price of the meat it's seasoning. A pinch, half a gram, is more than a denarius. Season it like a rich man's kitchen, and a fingernail of black dust costs you more than the pork under it. So your patty, seasoned with a light hand, costs you around 7 denarii in ingredients. Go heavy on pepper to taste like the cookbook wants, and the most expensive thing in the recipe is the one nobody can even see. But ingredients aren't the business. The business is the counter. And the counter has a mouth of its own to feed, whether you sell a single burger or not. You have to stand somewhere. A taberna, a ground floor shop opening onto the street, the good spots on a busy road, cost real money to rent. More than the airless garrets Romans slept in upstairs. And here I owe you honesty. I can't give you a clean rent figure in 301 denarii. The surviving rent numbers come from an earlier century in a different coinage, and dragging them across 300 years of Roman money being debased into confetti would be a lie dressed as a fact. So I'll model your rent as an assumption, not a quote. Roughly a laborer's daily wage per day, about 25 denarii. Then fuel. The fire under those pots doesn't burn air. Charcoal and wood every single day to keep the dolia hot from dawn. Call it another 10 denarii a day, and labor. You could work the counter yourself, but your own day has a price too. The 25 denarii you'd earn doing anything else. Or you hire a man to mind the pots while you buy meat. Either way, that's 25 denarii a day walking out the door. Add it up before a single customer arrives. Rent, fuel, 1 pair of hands. Call it 60 denarii a day. Gone. That's your nut. 2.5 days of a laborer's wages spent every morning just to open the doors. 60 denarii a day, and you haven't sold one burger. So the whole game becomes a single number. How many do you have to move to dig out of that hole? And is there anyone left in Rome willing to pay? Because nobody warned you about this when you signed the lease. Your biggest competitor isn't the counter next door. It's the emperor. And he's giving food away for free. Rome fed its own poor, not as charity, as politics, as the price of not having a hungry mob tear the city apart. The system was called the annona. For centuries, the state handed out free grain to a fixed list of citizens. By the time of Caesar and Augustus, that list ran to around 200,000 men in the city of Rome. Then it got worse for you. In the 270s, the Emperor Aurelian stopped handing out raw grain and started handing out bread, baked, free. He even made the loaves bigger and organized the bakers into a guild to produce them. Around 200,000 loaves a day given to the people at no charge. Look at what that does to your shop. A huge slice of your city wakes up every morning with free bread already in hand. You cannot sell bread to a man the government is giving bread to. The cheapest, most obvious thing a food stall could push, carbs to fill a belly, is worthless to you because the emperor undercut you to zero before you were born. So the free bread doesn't just take customers. It shoves you up market whether you like it or not. Your only play is the thing the dole doesn't cover, meat, something hot and fatty and seasoned that a free loaf can never be. The burger isn't a choice anymore. It's the only lane the state left open, which is the trap closing around you. The one product you're allowed to win with is built from the two most dangerous ingredients on your shelf: meat that spoils and pepper that costs more than silver. Now let's run the register and see if the math actually clears. Every morning, you're 60 denarii in the hole. Each burger costs you about 7 to make. So every burger has to earn back its own 7 and chip at that 60 on top. What can you charge? This is the honest wall of the whole experiment. The edict caps what you pay for ingredients, but no surviving source gives the retail price of a single cooked patty at a thermopolium counter. So the sale price is the one number I'm genuinely guessing, and it's the number the entire business hangs on. So let's guess like an operator, not a fantasist. A hot meat meal, real food, not a dole loaf, is a small luxury for a working man. Price it at 15 denarii, a bit over half a day's wage for a laborer. Enough to hurt, not enough to stop him. He buys it on payday, not every day. At 15 denarii sold and 7 to make. Each burger clears about 8 denarii of margin. Now do the division. To cover the 60 denarii nut, you need to sell 8 burgers a day just to break even. 8 burgers to stand still. Burger number 9 is the first coin you actually keep. And a busy counter on a good street can move a lot more than 9. Say a decent day is 40 burgers. That's 320 denarii of margin, minus your 60 of fixed costs, around 260 denarii of profit. In a day, more than 10 times what the laborer at your counter earns for his. Sell 40 a day, 6 days a week, and in a month you clear more than 5 times what a skilled Roman craftsman takes home in the same month. So there's your answer. Yes, you can get rich selling burgers in ancient Rome. But look at how thin the ledge is that you're standing on. The profit is real, and it's fragile, and every one of the numbers that makes it work is a number that can turn on you. Sell only 9 burgers on a slow day, and you clear a few denarii. You basically worked for free. The margin lives entirely on volume, which means it lives entirely on your location, which means the difference between rich and ruined is whether your counter sits on a busy road or a dead one. Same recipe, same prices, same effort. 1 block over, you starve. Then there's the pepper, seasoned to please a Roman palate raised on apicius, and that 800 denarii a pound dust eats your margin 1 pinch at a time. The dish that survives in the cookbook is a rich man's dish. The dish that makes you money is a poorer, plainer thing, light on the pepper, heavy on the soaked bread stretching the meat. To profit, you don't cook the famous recipe, you cook a cheaper ghost of it, and behind all of it stands the emperor with his free bread, holding the floor of the entire market down, making sure the easy money, cheap carbs to a hungry city is a business that can never exist. He shoved you into meat, and meat is exactly where a spoiled batch of pork on a hot day wipes out a week of profit in an afternoon. So the real answer isn't a number, it's a shape. Selling burgers in ancient Rome is a thin margin, high volume, location is everything grind, running on the one product a welfare state left uncovered, seasoned by the most overpriced spice on earth. Get all of it right and you out-earn a craftsman 10-1. Get the street wrong, or the pepper heavy, or the meat old, and you're back working someone else's counter for 25 denarii a day. A hungry city with no kitchens will always pay a man to cook. The Romans knew it. They just made sure he had to fight the emperor for the privilege. If you'd run this stall, free bread across the street and all, subscribe and I'll hand you the next impossible Roman business plan.
In 1772, the most powerful corporation on earth ran out of money. Not a small company, not a startup, a company with its own army, its own navy, its own currency, a company that ruled 30 million people and collected more tax revenue than most European kingdoms. And when it came begging to the government for a rescue, the British Parliament faced a question no one had ever asked before. What do you do when a company is too big to fail? Their answer saved the company. It also, and I promise this is true, helped start the American Revolution. This is the story of the world's first corporate bailout. And if parts of it sound familiar, that's the point. The East India Company started in 1600 as a spice trading business. 218 investors, one royal charter, and a monopoly on English trade with Asia. For 150 years, it did what trading companies do. Bought low in India, sold high in London, made its shareholders comfortably rich. Then, in 1757, everything changed. At the Battle of Plassey, the company's private army defeated the ruler of Bengal, the richest province in India. And 8 years later, the Mughal emperor handed the company something no business had ever held before: the Diwani, the legal right to collect taxes from Bengal itself. Read that again. A corporation, with shareholders, dividends, and a board of directors, was now the tax authority for 20 to 30 million people. The money was staggering. Roughly £3 million a year flowed in. In today's terms, hundreds of millions. The company wasn't trading with an empire anymore. It was the empire. Back in London, the stock went vertical. Everyone wanted in. Politicians owned shares. Bankers owned shares. Speculators borrowed money to buy shares, because how could taxing an entire country ever go wrong? The company, flush with confidence, raised its dividend, then raised it again. By 1771, it was paying shareholders 12.5%, a payout set not by what the company earned, but by what the shareholders wanted to hear. Remember that detail. It matters. Here's what the stock price didn't show. In Bengal, the company was a catastrophic government. It had one real policy: extract. Taxes stayed brutal in good years, and, this is the horrifying part, in bad ones. In 1769, the monsoon failed. Crops died. And in 1770, Bengal collapsed into one of the deadliest famines in human history. Somewhere around a third of the population perished. The company's response: tax collection in the famine year was enforced with such rigor that revenue barely dipped. Some officials privately admitted collections were kept up violently. Millions of the company's own taxpayers were dying. And the dividend in London went up. This is the part of the story where you should hear a quiet alarm bell, because a business that pays out more while its actual foundation is collapsing isn't reporting reality. It's performing it. The company's costs were exploding. Wars, forts, a standing army of tens of thousands. Its warehouses in London were stuffed with tea it couldn't sell, because smugglers undercut its taxed prices. It owed customs duties to the government. It owed the Bank of England. It owed everyone. And it papered over all of it with short-term loans, rolling debt forward month after month, betting that tomorrow's revenue would cover yesterday's promises. All it needed was for nothing to go wrong. On June 8, 1772, a Scottish banker named Alexander Fordyce got on a boat to France. He wasn't going on holiday. He was fleeing. Fordyce had been secretly gambling his bank's money, including a massive bet against East India stock, and he'd lost, catastrophically. Rather than face his partners, he simply left. His bank collapsed within days, and because 18th century banks were all tangled together in webs of credit, the collapse spread like fire through dry grass. London, Edinburgh, Amsterdam. Banks failed across 2 countries in weeks. Credit, the invisible fluid the whole economy ran on, froze solid. Sound familiar? It should. This was 2008 with powdered wigs, and standing directly in the path of the fire, the East India Company, the most indebted institution in Britain, whose entire survival depended on rolling over short-term loans, in a market where nobody was lending anymore. No. In July 1772, the company asked the Bank of England for help. It got a little. It needed more. By August, the directors were staring at bills coming due, over £1 million they simply did not have, including hundreds of thousands owed to the government itself. The unthinkable was suddenly on the table. The company that ruled India, the cornerstone of British trade, the stock and half of Parliament's portfolios, was weeks from collapse. And here's where the story stops being about a company and becomes about a question we still haven't answered 250 years later. If it fails, it takes the economy down with it. If you save it, you teach every giant that recklessness has no price. What do? Parliament did what governments have done ever since. It held furious hearings, expressed its outrage, demanded answers, and then wrote the check. In 1773, the government loaned the company £1.4 million, an enormous sum, to keep it breathing. But here's what makes this the first true bailout rather than just a loan. The money came with strings. The Regulating Act of 1773 gave the British state real power over the company for the first time. Government oversight of its Indian administration, a governor-general answerable to London, dividend caps, no more paying shareholders with imaginary money. The deal every bailout since has followed. We save you. We own a piece of you. Here's the trick the company had been running from the start. Paying dividends based on revenues it booked, not cash it collected, while hiding the gap in short-term paper that had to be endlessly renewed. Booked riches, borrowed reality. Companies still fail exactly this way today. But there was one more problem to solve. Remember those warehouses full of unsold tea? 17 million pounds of it, rotting in London while the company drowned. So Parliament passed a second law in 1773. A clever little scheme to turn that dead tea into cash. The Tea Act let the company ship its surplus directly to the American colonies, cheap, undercutting every local merchant and smuggler in the market. To London, it was an elegant piece of financial engineering. Rescue the company. Move the inventory. Everyone wins. The colonists read it differently. To them, it was a monopoly, propped up by a corrupt government being forced into their harbors. With a tax attached, they'd never voted for. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of them boarded those ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of bailout tea into the sea. You know what happened next. Escalation, occupation, Lexington, revolution. Trace the chain backward. A superpower is born because of a protest against a tea law passed to rescue a corporation that collapsed because it paid dividends with money it didn't have. The world's first too big to fail didn't just get bailed out. It accidentally redrew the map of the world. Since 1772, the pattern has repeated on a loop. An institution grows until its failure threatens everyone. It takes bigger risks because it knows that. It breaks. The government saves it. And everyone swears, never again. 1929, 1998, 2008. The East India Company limped on for another 80 years under growing state control until Britain finally absorbed it entirely. The first company too big to fail eventually became too controlled to exist. So here's the question for the comments. And I genuinely want your take. Was Parliament right to save it? Let it burn, and the whole economy might have gone with it. Save it, and you invent moral hazard. A lesson every giant since has learned by heart. 250 years later, we're still choosing it. If you want more stories about the schemes, collapses, and cons that built the modern economy, another one's on screen now.
On the 10th of October 2024, Switzerland handed the bank details of 3.7 million accounts to 108 foreign governments. Account balances, tax numbers, addresses, names. Switzerland sends that file every autumn. It has sent one every year since 2018. So if you are a foreigner with a Swiss bank account, your own tax office already has it. The balance, the interest earned, all of it without anybody asking. Swiss banking secrecy is the thing everyone thinks Switzerland sells. For foreign clients, it has been dead for most of a decade. And across that decade, the money went up. Swiss banks finished 2024 holding 9.28 trillion francs, 10% more than the year before. 4.2 trillion of it belongs to foreigners, which means almost everybody has the reason wrong. Here is the real one. Start with the story you have already been told. In 1934, the Swiss parliament passed a banking law. Article 47 of it made it a crime for a banker to say a client's name out loud. Not a sacking, not a lawsuit, prison. The reason usually given is that Switzerland was protecting Jewish depositors from the Nazis. Hitler had made holding money abroad a capital offense for Germans. Gestapo agents were in Zurich fishing for names, so the Swiss criminalized disclosure to save lives. It is a good story. The historians who went into the archives looking for it could not find it. Sebastian Gex at the University of Lausanne calls it propaganda, in those words, in the Business History Review. The actual paper trail leads somewhere much less flattering. It starts in a Paris apartment. October 1932, French police walked into a flat in Paris where two executives of the Basler Handels Bank were sitting with their French customers. On the table were the bank's notebooks. More than 1,000 French names were inside them. 3 senators, a dozen generals, 2 bishops, and the owners of Le Figaro and Le Matin, 2 of the largest newspapers in France. France was 3 years into a depression and raising taxes hard. The men writing that tax law kept their money in Basel. 2 years later, the Swiss parliament made disclosure a criminal matter. Article 47 went through inside a much larger banking law drafted after the Swiss bank crash of 1931, and at the time it caused almost no argument at all. The law was written for the customers the French police had just caught. It was written so that nobody would ever get another notebook. The refugee story arrived decades afterwards, from the banks themselves, when Switzerland needed an answer for why it had spent the war as everybody's cashier. Here is where it stops being funny. In the 1990s, Jewish families went to Swiss banks looking for the accounts their grandparents had opened before the war. Some of them were asked for a death certificate. For people killed at Auschwitz, it took a class action in New York in a settlement of $1.25 billion to end that argument. The banks settled in 1998. They admitted nothing. Now what Article 47 actually changed mechanically because this part survives everything that follows. Before 1934, a banker who leaked your name got sued by you. After 1934, he got prosecuted by the state. Switzerland took over the job of enforcing the banker's silence, at public expense, whether or not the client ever complained. That law is still on the books. Parliament strengthened it in 2015. 3 years in prison for leaking Swiss bank data. 5 if you profited. And since 2015, it also catches people who never worked at a bank. Journalists, for instance. In February 2022, a leak of more than 18,000 Credit Suisse accounts went out to news organizations in dozens of countries. They called it Swiss Secrets. Swiss papers were invited in. Ta Media, one of the largest publishers in the country, said no. Its editor-in-chief gave one sentence for the decision. This law is a massive restriction of press freedom in Switzerland. So Article 47 still works beautifully. It just stopped protecting anybody's money. Because between 2008 and 2018, the entire product came apart. Not by treaty and not by any government deciding to be decent. By one salesman from Boston who once walked diamonds through American customs in a tube of toothpaste. His name is Bradley Birkenfeld. From 2001, he sold Swiss accounts to rich Americans for UBS out of Geneva. The scale from a United States Senate investigation published in July 2008. Roughly 19,000 American clients holding somewhere near $20 billion the tax authorities had never been told about. Selling a secret account to an American means flying to America. So UBS bankers came in on tourist visas. They carried encrypted laptops. They were trained on what to say if a border officer asked them what they were doing in the country. Then they met the clients where rich Americans already gather, at parties the bank paid for. Art Basel and Miami Beach, a tennis tournament, a yacht race. Birkenfeld's biggest client was Igor Olenikov, a California property developer with around $200 million parked offshore. At one point, Birkenfeld bought diamonds in Europe with Olenikov's money. He packed them into a toothpaste tube and carried them through customs into the United States. In 2007, he walked into the United States Department of Justice and explained how the whole machine worked. He wanted immunity. He did not get it. He pleaded guilty in June 2008, was handed 40 months, and went to prison in January 2010. In September 2012, the American tax authorities paid him $104 million, the largest award they had ever made to an informant, collected by a convicted felon. Nobody has ever been paid better for a career change. Now the confidence. On the 19th of March 2008, the Swiss finance minister, Hans Rudolf Merz, told the European Union what would happen if it came after Swiss banking secrecy. You will break your teeth on it. 11 months later, Merz signed the emergency order that broke it himself. On the 18th of February 2009, the Swiss regulator FINMA ordered UBS to hand its American client files to Washington. The transfer went out the same afternoon. Somewhere between 250 and 300 people had their names put on a plane. The exact number still shifts depending on the source. UBS paid $780 million and admitted conspiring to defraud the United States. FINMA's reasoning ran like this. The Justice Department was days from indicting UBS. An indicted UBS might not survive the week. A dead UBS takes the Swiss economy down with it. So the regulator reached for emergency powers written for a bank run and used them to break the country's most famous law. 6 months later, Switzerland agreed to process American requests for 4,450 more accounts. On the 5th of January 2010, a Swiss court ruled that the February handover had been illegal. FINMA never had the authority. The files had been in Washington for 11 months. Then the Justice Department held the door open for everybody else. Between 2013 and 2016, 80 more Swiss banks signed non-prosecution agreements, handed over their account information, and paid $1.36 billion between them. 80 banks, one at a time. And underneath all of it, the Americans had already built the machine that settled the argument permanently. FATCA signed into law in 2010. The rule is short and brutal. Any foreign bank that will not report its American clients gets 30% withheld from every dollar of American income passing through it. No serious bank on the planet can survive that. Every one of them signed. Then the rest of the world copied the idea. The Common Reporting Standard, run out of the OECD in Paris. Switzerland agreed to it in 2014 and sent its first batch of data in the autumn of 2018 to 38 countries. 6 years later, it was sending to 108. So by 2018, the product is gone. Every foreign client of a Swiss bank is visible to their own tax office once a year, automatically, forever. Nobody left. Look at what those clients were prepared to swallow instead. In January 2015, the Swiss National Bank pushed its policy rate to minus 0.75%, and the commercial banks passed it straight down the line. If you were a wealthy foreigner sitting on a large cash balance in Zurich, your bank charged you rent for holding your own money. That ran for 7.5 years. Swiss banks paid 11.8 billion francs in negative interest to their own central bank across that stretch and handed the bill to their biggest customers. Added up from the customer's chair. Your government can see the account. The bank charges you to keep it. And in 2024, the money in Swiss banks rose 10% anyway, which tells you the secrecy was never the thing. So what is? Start with the franc. Under the post-war system, $1 American bought 4 francs and 38 centimes. Today it buys about 80 centimes. An American who moved $100,000 into Swiss francs in 1971 is sitting on about $540,000 today. No investment, no advice, no interest, just the currency. Inflation eats a chunk of that. It's still buried the dollar. Currencies do not behave that way by accident. Behind the franc sits a run of decisions Swiss voters made about themselves, in public at the ballot box. On the 2nd of December 2001, they voted on a constitutional rule capping how much their own federal government is allowed to borrow. 85% said yes. Swiss government debt now sits near 39% of the economy. The American number is 124. Then there is rule of law, which is the expensive one. Rule of law only counts when it is inconvenient. On the 19th of March 2023, Credit Suisse died. UBS bought it over a single weekend for 3 billion francs in a deal the Swiss government arranged. And FINMA wrote 16.5 billion francs of Credit Suisse bonds down to zero, while the shareholders ranked below those bonds still got paid. That is backwards. Every bond investor on earth noticed. Switzerland had just done the exact thing it sells insurance against. In October 2025, the Swiss Federal Administrative Court threw the write-down out. Unlawful. The bondholders won. It is being appealed. Think about who won that. A court in Bern overruled the regulator, the finance ministry, and the largest bank in the country. It did it 2.5 years after the fact. It did it for foreign bondholders who cannot vote in Switzerland and have never set foot in the place. That ruling is the product. The mountains are scenery. And then Switzerland does the thing no other financial center will do. It puts the question to its own people. On the 30th of November 2025, the country held a referendum on a 50% inheritance tax on estates over 50 million francs. The young socialists had put it on the ballot. 78% of Swiss voters rejected it. No brochure can tell a billionaire what that vote told him. The tax rules here get written by people who keep voting against taxing wealth. Underneath all of it sits a stretch of quiet nobody else can offer. The last foreign army to occupy Bern was Napoleon's in 1798. The last fighting on Swiss soil was a civil war in 1847 that ran 25 days and killed around 93 men. 2 world wars went round the outside. Every other city that has held serious money has a far worse century somewhere in the file. Vienna, Berlin, Shanghai, Beirut. So here's the answer the films never use. Switzerland sells the most boring product in finance and the hardest one on earth to manufacture. The promise that in 50 years, this place will still work exactly the way it works today. Same courts, same currency, same country. A dictator wants secrecy, and he can buy secrecy in a dozen cheaper places. A family with 400 million francs and a 100-year horizon wants somewhere the judges still function in 2075, and the money is still called the franc. Very few countries can promise that and be believed. Switzerland sat at the top of that list for as long as anyone has counted. It came off the top last year. On the 27th of May 2026, Boston Consulting Group published its annual count of the world's cross-border money. Hong Kong finished 2020 holding $2.95 trillion of other people's wealth. Switzerland finished with 2.94, $10 billion apart. The first time Switzerland has not been first. Nothing had to leave Switzerland for that to happen. Swiss cross-border holdings rose 10% in 2024 to 2.4 trillion francs. The money that moved was newer money. It came out of mainland China, and it went to the nearest place with courts it could believe in. Switzerland's promise has been under test since 1815, and it has held every time. Hong Kong's version of that promise is 1 year old. Ask again in 2075. In the summer of 1324, the price of gold in Cairo fell off a cliff. Not because of a war, not a bad harvest, not a sultan clipping his own coins to stretch the treasury. Gold fell because one man was passing through town, and he was too generous. He wasn't a merchant. He wasn't there to trade. He was on his way to Mecca, and he'd only stopped in Egypt to rest the camels. He stayed 3 months. By the time he left, the money changers of Cairo, men whose entire job was knowing what gold was worth, had watched it come unglued in their hands. His name was Musa. In his own language, the title in front of it meant King of Kings, Mansa Musa. And the reason his story is hard to tell isn't that we know too little about his money. It's that his money can't be measured. I mean that literally. Every honest historian who's tried has put down the pen. We'll get to why. First, the caravan. Musa became Mansa of Mali around 1312. He inherited an empire most people today couldn't place on a map, and it was enormous. A stretch of West Africa that would now cut through Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Niger, parts of Nigeria, Mauritania, Chad. He was a devout Muslim, and a devout Muslim who can afford it makes the pilgrimage to Mecca once in his life. Musa could afford it the way the ocean can afford to be wet. So in 1324 he went, not quietly. Here are the numbers the chroniclers wrote down. And understand, these are round, boastful, second-hand numbers, not a census. 60,000 people in the column, something like 100 camels, each carrying between 50 and 300 pounds of gold dust. 500 men walking out front, each holding a staff of solid gold that weighed about 6 pounds. Do the arithmetic on just those staffs, and you get 3,000 pounds of gold walking ahead of him, purely so the road would look right. And here is the part the spectacle was built on, the part the gold pictures leave out. 12,000 of the people in that column were enslaved. They wore silk and brocade because Musa dressed them to look magnificent, and many of them carried the gold bars on their own backs across the Sahara. The most dazzling display of wealth in the medieval world moved forward on the shoulders of people who owned nothing, not even themselves. Gold and enslaved people were the two things Mali sold to the world. On this trip, Musa brought both and made no distinction between them. They were freight. The caravan reached Cairo in July, and Cairo was not a town that impressed easily. It was one of the great cities of the world, the seat of the Mamluk Sultan, a place that had seen every kind of rich man. It had not seen this. Musa started handing gold away almost immediately as gifts to the officials who received him, to the scholars, to the poor in the street, to anyone who came near the man. The Egyptian historian Al-Umar-e, who reached Cairo 12 years later and talked to people who were there, wrote it down plainly. Musa left no court emir nor holder of a royal office without the gift of a load of gold. A load to every single one. There's a scene from those first days that tells you exactly who he was. The Sultan of Egypt invited him to the citadel. Protocol said a visitor kisses the ground before the Sultan or kisses his hand. Musa refused. He was a king. He prostrated himself to no man. For days there was a standoff. The richest visitor in Cairo's history and the man who ruled it deadlocked over a bow. Musa finally found a way through. He knelt and said he was prostrating himself to God, who had created him. Honor intact. Then he sat down with the Sultan as an equal. That's the man. He wouldn't bow to a sultan, but he'd hand a fortune to a stranger without being asked. Here's what happens when one man has too much gold. In 1324, a West African king named Mansa Musa spent 3 months in Cairo on his way to Mecca and gave away so much gold that he broke the price of it. There was so much new gold suddenly in the city that each coin was worth less. According to the historian Al-Umar-e, before Musa arrived, a unit of gold traded for about 25 silver pieces. After he left, it slid to under 22 and stayed down for roughly 12 years. One tourist, spending pocket money and an entire economy's currency, wobbled for over a decade. It's one of the only times in recorded history one person's generosity registered as a financial event. And the strangest part is what he did on the way home, which made it worse. Now, honesty, because this is the number the whole legend rests on. That gold crasher's story comes almost entirely from one source, Al-Umar-e, and one line. The price fell from 25 to 22 and stayed there 12 years. That's roughly a 10 to 12% drop, not a total collapse. And at least one modern historian, Warren Schultz, has looked at Mamluk gold prices and argued a swing that size was well within the normal bounce of the market. That Musa may have nudged a price that was already moving. So the movie version, Mansa Musa single-handedly wrecking Egypt's economy, is probably too big. But strip it back to what everyone agrees on, and it's still astonishing. A private traveler's spending was large enough that serious people, then and now, argue about whether he moved the price of gold in one of the world's biggest cities. Nobody argues about whether you or I could. The question only exists because of how much he had, and what he had was running out. Now the reversal, nobody tells you about the richest man in history. On the way home, Mansa Musa went broke. He'd given so much away, spent so freely across Cairo and Mecca, in the whole route, that by the time he was heading back through Egypt, the gold was gone. The bottomless caravan had a bottom after all. So the richest man alive did what broke men do. He borrowed. He went to the Egyptian merchants and money changers, the same market he'd flooded, and took loans at a steep rate of interest to fund the trip home. Follow the money both ways. The merchants of Cairo made a fortune off Mansa Musa on the way in when he was handing gold to strangers. Then they made a second fortune off him on the way out, lending his own gold back to him at interest. Some accounts say he bought up gold at high prices, trying to pull it back out of the market and lift the value again. The world's first accidental attempt at propping up a currency, run by a man who didn't know he'd sunk it. Either way, the Cairenes, as Al-Umari put it, made incalculable profits out of him. He came in as the most generous man they'd ever seen. He left as their best customer. The city that couldn't believe its luck when he arrived was sorry to see him go for entirely mercenary reasons, which raises the question that actually matters. Where does that much gold even come from? Because a man doesn't fund all this out of a mine he owns. Mali's wealth ran on something stranger, and Musa didn't own it at all. Mali sat on top of two of the richest gold fields in the medieval world, Bambouk and Bouray, along the upper rivers of West Africa. In an age when gold was money itself, This region was pumping out an almost unbelievable share of it. By some estimates, 2/3 of the gold circulating in the entire Mediterranean world came from West Africa, close to half the old world supply. The twist is that he didn't own the mines. He couldn't. The goldfields were kept deliberately outside his direct control, run by local people who guarded their independence. And legend held that the day a man tried to conquer the goldfields outright, the miners simply stopped, and the gold stopped coming. So Musa never squeezed the source. He taxed the flow, and the flow moved on the back of the least glamorous substance imaginable: salt. The richest empire of the Middle Ages didn't run on gold. It ran on salt. In the West African interior, gold was everywhere and salt was almost impossible to get. No coast, brutal heat, and a body that can't survive without it. So salt became precious. Miners in the Sahara cut it out of the ground in slabs the size of doors. Camel caravans hauled those slabs south for weeks. And down in the gold country, men would trade it close to weight for weight, plain salt for gold. The empire of Mali sat exactly in the middle of that swap, taxing every load that crossed it in both directions. That's the secret behind the man usually called the richest human who ever lived. Not a gold mine, a crossroads. Every caravan that carried salt south and gold north crossed Musa's territory and paid to do it. That's the engine, a choke point on the busiest trade route in Africa. The gold that stunned Cairo was never sitting in a palace vault. It was a tax on a river of commerce that never stopped moving. Musa's genius wasn't having gold. Plenty of kings had gold. His genius was owning the road it traveled on. And when he came home from Mecca, he spent the road's earnings on something that outlasted him. On the pilgrimage, Musa had met an architect and poet from Muslim Spain named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili and brought him back to Mali. For one royal audience chamber, the ledger of Ibn Khaldun, one of the greatest historians of the medieval world, records what Musa paid the man: 12,000 mithqals of gold, around 110 pounds of it, for a single building. That was the small project. Musa poured money into Timbuktu and Jehne, cities that were already trade hubs and became something more. He funded the great Jinguereber Mosque. He endowed the schools that grew into what people would later call the University of Timbuktu, where within a couple of generations, the trade in handwritten books was so rich that scholars said manuscripts turned a better profit than almost anything else in the market. The man who broke the gold price in Cairo went home and turned a desert trading post into one of the intellectual capitals of the Islamic world. The gold that had been freight on the backs of enslaved men became libraries. Both of those things are true about the same fortune. Neither cancels the other. Now, how did a king in West Africa end up famous in Europe, on a continent he never visited? A map. In 1375, a Jewish mapmaker named Abraham Kresk, working on the island of Majorca, drew what we now call the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important maps of the medieval world. Down in the empty space where Europeans knew almost nothing, he drew a king, seated on a throne, crowned, holding up a single lump of gold the size of a fist. The caption named him the richest and most noble king in all the land, on account of the great quantity of gold in his country. Kresk had never been to Mali. He'd never seen Musa, who by then had been dead for decades. He was drawing a rumor, a story that had traveled from Cairo to the Mediterranean and hardened into the single fact every European knew about the African interior. Somewhere south of the desert, there was a king made of gold. 200 years later, ships would sail down the coast of Africa hunting for the source of it. So how rich was he really? Put a number on it. You can't, and the honest historians won't. You'll see $400 billion thrown around. That figure is a guess dressed as arithmetic, and the people who study Mali for a living call it meaningless. You can't take a 14th century economy running on gold dust and salt slabs and convert it into modern dollars without the whole thing turning to nonsense. There's no ledger. There's no estate inventory. There's a caravan that moved so much gold the chroniclers gave up counting and just wrote immeasurable. We don't even know when he died. The best guess is 1337. It might be 1332. The richest man who may have ever lived, and we can't fix the year he stopped breathing. What survives isn't a number. It's a picture. A mapmaker in Mahir Kha who never crossed the sea, drawing a king he'd never met from a story that came in with the gold. A crowned man on a throne at the edge of the known world, holding up a nugget as if to say, "It's all real, come and see." If you want the next story of a fortune too big for the ledger to hold, subscribe.